Hello again. I'm happy to present the third paper in our March meeting paper series presented this evening. Our next presenter is Sarah Johnson. Sarah is a curator whose research focuses on modern and contemporary art from the Middle East, with a particular emphasis on Iraq. Her other research interests include intellectual histories of modernisms in the region and provenance histories of Middle Eastern objects in museums. She is a curator for the Middle East and North African collections at the National Museum of World Culture in the Netherlands. Previously, Johnson was a curator of Islamic collections at the British Museum in London. She was also a researcher in the curatorial department at the Smithsonian Institution, Freer and Sackler Galleries in Washington, D.C., where she helped organize the permanent galleries of ancient Iran and the traveling exhibition Roads of Arabia. Johnson's recent publications include a chapter in the monograph Tracing Constellations, Belonging and Exile in the Practice of Walid City and Impure Time, Archaeology, Hafid al-Drubi, and the Persistence of Representational Art in the mid-20th century Iraq between 1940 and 1980. In the Arab Studies Journal in 2020. Her doctoral dissertation focused on the Iraqi artist Hafid al-Drubi and alternative aesthetic modernities in the Middle East. We will be taking questions from the audience in the final 5 minutes. Simultaneous translation to Arabic is available in the chat box. I would like now to invite Sarah to present her paper.
Thank you so much, Nora, and thank you to Sharjah Art Foundation for making this possible, even if from afar. Without further ado, I will share my screen so you can see my much more interesting images. Right, so I will be speaking today about an exhibition from the museum where I work, which is the Dutch National Museum for World Cultures. Which was founded in 2014 as a conglomeration of 4 different museums across the Netherlands for ethnographic collections and a kind of reimagining of those 4 museums. One being the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, which I will be speaking about today, the Volkenkunde Museum in Leiden, and the Wereld Museum in Rotterdam, and the Africa Museum in Berkendal in the east of the country, and these 4 collections are now brought together and move around those museums. And a small disclaimer, I did not curate this exhibition, so I would like to thank the curator, Okwui Enwezor, and the museum for allowing me to discuss this exhibition and the objects from the Middle East and North Africa that are shown here and how they are displayed. So I wanted to speak about this exhibition, which is on the topic of gender, because I was interested in the call about thinking historically in the present. That was part of the March meetings call this year. And I thought that perhaps the way this gender exhibition deals with ethnographic collections and with this question of time and the contemporary might be able to contribute something to this discussion, and something quite different from just talking about contemporary art. And so I'm going to look at this exhibition, which opened in 2019, and it was called What's a Genderful World? And the idea behind this exhibition is that the National Museum for World Cultures decided to look at a series of topics that are popular in contemporary discourse and in the media today, one being gender. There will also be an exhibition on hip hop, and to see what the collections can speak to about these topics. So rather than kind of coming up with traditional ethnographic thematic exhibitions, the idea was to kind of impose these contemporary issues on the collection, which is already an interesting way to think about history and the present. And so the exhibition described itself, and I quote, on the website as, quote, "Gender is a hot topic, but did you know that what we see as masculine or feminine is largely culturally determined? In a festival-like setting, dive into the world of gender and discover how this is expressed and experienced worldwide." So as you can hear from this description, the exhibition tried to relate this to the visitor's own life and own experience and to the contemporary. And it did this through a diverse range of objects. So not just the historic or the ethnographic collections, but also contemporary arts, pop culture, film, photography, fashion, and personal narratives, as we will see. And I'll be focusing here on the Middle East and North Africa objects. So I was interested in a 2014 article by Maria Clavo, where she asked why in ancient Greek, Roman, and ancient Egyptian galleries in art museums, we don't see contemporary art interventions. And she was kind of asking, why we're using contemporary art interventions in certain contexts. And these contexts often fall outside of the traditional narrative of art history that sort of evolves from ancient Egypt through to ancient Rome and beyond. And so we wouldn't see, for example, in this picture of the ancient Egypt galleries in the British Museum, as often a kind of contemporary arts intervention to contextualize. But actually, what intrigued me is that what's going on in the gender exhibition in the Tropen Museum is kind of the opposite of this. And what we see here is the entrance to the exhibition, which has a sculpture of Hatshepsut from the pharaonic periods in ancient Egypt. And so this has actually been inserted into the ethnographic context. And so this sort of canonical sculpture of art history has been stripped of that hierarchy within this context. And it's been placed in a different temporal context as well, which interested me. And so the reason that you see Hatshepsut here is because this section is about cross-dressing. And what the label does very well is it's not saying that Hatshepsut has something to do with the contemporary cross-dressing today, but it's saying that explaining that in that time period she herself was dressing as a man, often to assert her power. So it gives context to the kind of cross-dressing that she was participating in. And what's even more interesting is the objects that are around her. So we see behind her prints, 19th century Japanese prints, showing male actors dressing as women in the theater. We also see shadow puppets from Indonesia from the 20th century. And on the left-hand side by the label, you see a 2018 gender-neutral outfit from a designer, Maison de Faux. So you see quite a few different temporalities mixed together. So it's not just an ancient statue next to part of the Tropen Museum collection. There is a diversity of objects there, so that the space doesn't reduce the objects to an ambiguous timelessness, but rather distorts our notion of hierarchical temporalities that's kind of embodied in this Hatshepsut sculpture. So we see a similar disruption going on in this disruption to the art historical canon in this display, which is titled, "Does Your Body Determine Your Gender?" So what we see in the backgrounds are three 17th century miniatures from Iran. And then in front of them, we see a anthropomorphic vase from the early 20th century from Congo, which would have been an object more typically on display in the Tropen Museum in an ethnographic context. What was of interest to me is that these miniature paintings are now, they are kind of removed from the art historical canon, and they're placed more thematically, and we could say more in this ethnographic context where the technique of the painting and the maker is somewhat removed, but it also asks us different kind of questions about those objects, which perhaps are fruitful for reimagining how they could be displayed. Now, sometimes these combinations bring up, allow for a political or conscious of the colonial context of the collections of the Tropen Museum. And this image comes from a section of the exhibition, which is on face covering. And this section includes here, you see on the right-hand side, an Ottoman watercolor of an Armenian bride. And on the left, you see a children's animated cartoon from 2013 from Pakistan, and it's called, it's a series called Burqa Avengers. And so, and then next to what you don't see in the image is next to that, you also have a 20th century Afghan face covering as well. And so it's what I find different about this is that rather than introducing a contemporary artwork to deal with the politics of face covering, here a cartoon is brought in, a children's cartoon, and in this cartoon, which is in itself highly controversial, and I won't get into those controversies, but what I'm really interested in here is the way it introduces politics. So it deals with, there's a woman who, when she's sort of fighting evil, she puts on a burqa and then fights different topics like corruption within her town. And so it brings in the contemporary in a way that's perhaps unusual, a bit different for the visitor, and then perhaps brings a different conversation to the Ottoman watercolor, which is next to it. But of course, here you have a huge temporal leap. And so what I consider in this display or question is perhaps it would be even more powerful if one were to introduce more 20th century discussions around the politics of face covering in between to kind of give depth to that transition between the watercolor and the cartoon. So there's another very interesting introduction of politics and colonial history into the exhibition, and that's this section on male grooming. And what you see here is on the top, it's an early 20th century watercolor from India, which shows a European man being groomed by Indian servants. And the label explains the colonial context and the criticality of this object. And then below it, which is a bit hard to see with the coloring, you have also a Guyanese grooming kit from Suriname in South America. And these objects are placed together. They're from the same time period, which I think is very important. So you actually have a temporal conjunction, but very different context and geography. But it's interesting to, in a way, consider if this print behind the watercolor brings in the colonial context of the Guyanese objects, because of course the Guyanese objects came into the Tropen Museum and to the Netherlands also through colonial channels. It has a colonial history in itself. So this perhaps can be brought to light through this combination. But of course, the theme is about grooming. So the question is, how much does the visitor really get out of that combination? But I thought it was quite an original combination of objects. Perhaps I think the most effective display in the exhibition around bringing up global modernities and political context was the one about male facial hair from the Middle East. in the 20th century. And here you see on the left a photograph from, and I won't get into the question and criticism and discussion around enlarging photographs here. Many people have discussed this in the past, and definitely something to debate. But you see in the far right background of the photo on the left, a 19th century photograph of an older man with a beard. And then on the left, these are actually studio photographs from the 1960s from Baghdad, with a younger man with a mustache. And that was meant to show the transition to removing facial hair, removing beards, how that related to modern fashions and also to politics. And then on the right-hand side, you see this is a group of men, a contemporary group of men in Erbil in Kurdistan, who celebrate having beards. And what I really like about this combination is that it has several different temporalities within the same geography. And that really helps the visitor to understand the context of the contemporary introduction of this group in Erbil with a much richer and more diverse context than simply jumping from the 19th century photograph to the group in Erbil. So within this this question, I would like to look at a display that deals with lots of different geographies and different time periods. And I think in this context, it's a bit more difficult to make that transition into the contemporary or understand how the different temporalities are interacting. And this is also complicated by the introduction in the label. So I added the label on the left of a contemporary phenomenon. And this was, of course, a way to introduce the contemporary more from a popular culture standpoint. But I would question, yes, how does that, what does that add to this kind of these kind of objects? So what you see here is a display around the power and taboo of genitals in the question of gender, and you see a few objects that are quite typical for ethnographic collections. They range from the 6th to the 21st century. You have objects from Mexico, from Papua New Guinea, mostly sculptural, but then you see on the left, these are actually studio photographs, again from Iraq, from the middle to late 20th century. And so you see, I think it's very interesting here to actually introduce photography and to question kind of modes of representation, the introduction of modernity. It really might make us think about the objects differently, especially within this thematic framework. But the question is, how is that done, and how much is gets across to the visitor? And on the left-hand side, you see that the slide is bringing up a quote from Ariana Grande, so very much a popular culture quote that actually happened in 2018. But this quote is not contextualized really in the label. So we don't really know that this is a particular phenomenon from 2018. And I would even ask, okay, how can one moment in 2018 therefore relate to such a diverse range of objects? And so what does that really add to the exhibition? And lastly, I would like to talk about contemporary art, which is introduced throughout the exhibition in different ways. But it's often introduced again with a sort of dissolution of hierarchies. So objects that might circulate in a global contemporary arts context are, for example, this collage by Nermin Hammam, The Break from 2011, which you see here on the left. is placed next to, again, studio photography and Indian film posters, and that are anonymous, they are mass produced, and they're all within the theme of masculinity and portraying masculinity. So by creating these thematic groupings, it also dissolves in a way the kind of social hierarchies of these objects, which I find interesting. In a way, pokes holes at our the power dynamics of contemporary arts, but of course it doesn't give room for the visitor to also understand the differences between these social hierarchies, which I think is interesting, especially in a display around masculinities and the portrayal of masculinities, because of course this also does have something to do with social hierarchies and geographic contexts, which perhaps in this way are not so clear. But I do think it's also quite a different and perhaps novel way of presenting contemporary arts, and might perhaps lead us to different thinking about this, because this is integrated, as I said, into many different kinds of contemporary, so not just contemporary arts, but popular culture, etc. within this context. But throughout the exhibition, what I kept thinking about is this middle part that's missing. So you have a diversity of contemporaries, but there was still missing enough contextualization of modernity and of colonialism to help visitors to move across into the contemporary. So I think in that way, this call to think historically in the present is perhaps related to that. And I think in this way actually might provide a useful tool for ethnographic museums to rethink the way they are presenting the contemporary and history. And I will now take questions, I think. Let me stop sharing my screen. Okay, I will now take any questions.
Thank you
from the audience. Yeah, if there are any, and I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to this presentation.
Thank you. So first question from the audience, were any, from Nasser Zayani, were any of the contemporary works commissioned as a response to specific pieces in the collection?
Very good question. Okay, so in this exhibition, no, there weren't, but we are trying more and more to incorporate commissioned work that responds more directly to work in the exhibition. Yeah. So we have, for example, at the moment in an exhibition on Oceania, again curated by Vonoves, a work by George Nuku, which was built within the context of the exhibition itself.
Thank you. Is the inclusion of contemporary pop culture references specific to this exhibition or used across the museum? What are your thoughts on the role of contemporary pop culture in the ethnographic exhibition overall?
Very good question. It's actually, we have a curator now for popular culture. So it's something we are debating a lot. So what's the meaning of popular culture? And I think the biggest debate is where does popular culture actually come from? And are we just regurgitating a lot of American capitalist images, and are we properly contextualizing that? So this is something we are quite wary of at the moment with popular culture.
What lessons would you share for other ethnographic museums rethinking how to use their collections in the 21st century?
That's a very good question. I would almost want to ask back if we were all together in the same place. But I think it's questioning really using a diversity of media, of social context. So, not maybe just immediately reaching out to global contemporary arts when trying to be critical of the collection.
We have time for one more question. Doesn't the ethnographic museum model inadvertently center the home country's perspective and present all other cultures in relation to it? How can this be disrupted?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I think it's it's almost unavoidable. You have to, I think, often just remind the visitor of that perspective because the collection of objects in themselves are a reflection of the people who collected them, of course. But I think the most important thing is to allow for different voices to take control and to not try to direct too much those outside voices that are brought in. So it's something we're trying to do today. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We're reconvening in 10 minutes for our final presentation for today with Sadia Shirazi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.